You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, how are MYOB tickets shaping up?
Oh, really good. I think I only need 7 more people before I don't lose my shirt.
Oh, really? You're 7 people from the threshold?
Yeah. And then, anything above that is all gravy. So it's still a little nerve-wracking given COVID, but it seems like a lot of people just want to get away.
My sense is this thing is really building. I can't get over the number of clients of ours that we talk to who are going to this. Like, there's a real buzz within our client base, and obviously there's some overlap between ours and yours.
Yeah.
I'm surprised at the buzz going on here. Like I've said to you before, I think the timing is perfect. There's such a need for this. And as more time goes by, I'm like, I'm not one for FOMO. Like, that's not something I generally experience. I understand life is a series of trade-offs.
Yeah.
But I'm having the tiniest little bit of like FOMO over not being able. I'm not going to cancel my trip to Greece or anything.
It's either be with me or aren't you celebrating some anniversary or something?
Yeah, there's a wedding anniversary. The driving force is a speaking gig in Athens, but my wife and I are going to Santorini for a bunch before that. So it's all like, yeah.
You'll be fine.
Yeah.
I'm not feeling sorry for you.
Okay. Well, I'm glad it's going on. Again, I'm sorry I'm not going to be there, but let's talk whatever it is we do here. I don't want to read out this title. You wrote Prostitutes and Scope Creep. David, the word is sex workers.
I'm not taking a lecture from you about.
You saw my tweet the other day?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, but something about you want to rename this thing. Are you serious about that?
Well, every time I hear scope creep, I want to put a comma between scope and creep. So fix the scope, creep. But I haven't figured out how to work the material into the headline. Give me enough time and I will.
Yeah, maybe using prostitute in the title is considered clickbaity, but it's actually true.
What do you mean? What's true? Tell the story here.
Oh, so back in 2009, I was commissioned to write an article for Communication Arts. I'd been writing for them regularly, 3 or 4 articles a year. And it was a tight deadline. I was up late the night before so that I could get the article to the editor. And just sort of on a lark, I decided to throw a sentence on the end of the article. And I knew the editor, and she was great, and we had a good relationship. And I knew she would think it was just a joke and not publish it, right? So at the end of the article, I said, prostitutes are better at running their businesses than creatives for 3 reasons. And I thought for sure she'd get a big kick out of it and not publish it. Well, anyway, it got published. So I get all of these notes from people, some really upset about the concept and others thinking it was really funny. So that's the story about Prostitutes and Scope Creep. It was never supposed to be published, but it was. And so I'm just going to fully lean into this now. And my argument was that prostitutes are better at running their businesses than creatives for 3 reasons. Here are the 3 reasons. They get all their money up front. Full service means full service, and there is no scope creep. And I thought, that's really funny. I don't know. Do you think it's funny?
I think it was funnier in 2009, but I still want to insert the comma between there is no scope, comma, creep.
Yeah.
No, there's a clearly defined scope.
Yeah.
Knowing nothing about the sex worker trade, speaking for myself here, let's bring it back to creative firms. So you put this out there. I remember it generating a lot of discussion. People talked about it a lot. I've mentioned it a few times. Where do you want to go with this? Or we're going to unpack why scope creep happens, how to prevent it. Where do you want to go with it?
This will probably be a shorter episode, which is fine.
So you don't have much, is what you're saying?
No, what I have is really boiled down to essential concepts. It's sort of humorous, but also serious. So there's various ways you can handle scope creep. I try to think of as many as I could. Some are sort of silly, some are real, but there are really 7 ways you can handle scope creep. And I just want to have a bigger discussion about this because in every firm that is not maximizing their financial performance, there is almost always some degree of underpricing and or overservicing, which is all tied around scope creep. And I know that this gets pretty complicated when we think about the impact of scope creep and different pricing methodologies and so on. But still, there's enough common ground here that I think people will see their situation as we talk about the 7 options that there are to deal with scope creep.
So if we back up a little bit and think more fundamentally about the sources of scope creep, I can put into 2 categories the source. One category is the client. We tend to think of the client as the guilty party or the devil here. The client is forcing scope creep. But it's not always the client, is it?
It's not at all. No, in fact, you'll find in a lot of firms still the team cares more about quality than the client does. And so they are on their own without being asked, adding a lot more effort than the client is paying for. And that's just another version of scope creep, right? So I don't want to imply that the client is always the problem here, but it is still something that must be dealt with. And I think when you hear these different reasons and different approaches, your job is to decide what is your philosophy on scope creep. And by the way, I should just mention that I don't really care if individual projects are profitable. I just don't think that matters.
Yeah.
What really matters is the entire relationship with the client. And so when we're talking about scope creep, we're really not talking about it at a project level, but more the client relationship level.
Yeah, slight tangent. When you are employing value-based pricing, getting paid for the value that you create rather than the inputs or the outputs, you're taking on more risk for potentially more reward. You increase the risk that a project isn't going to be profitable. Now, as long as you have a mechanism built in, like an after-action review, to review every project after it's delivered in the pricing and to say, did we price this properly, et cetera, then you grow from there. You just embrace the idea that you just stated, David, that not every project has to be profitable. We aim to get to this place where they're almost always profitable, but we allow for mistakes as long as we're growing. We're reviewing those mistakes and growing.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes we've just made a mistake in scoping it, and it's a rare mistake, and we review, we learn our lesson, and we'll scope it and price it better the next time. But in some firms, it's just systemic, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you ever heard out of the mouths of agency principals or other key team members, people proudly say, we under-promise and over-deliver?
Under-promise and over-deliver. Have I ever heard them say that?
Yeah. We under-promise. We don't promise too much, but we always over-deliver. I've heard people say that. I've seen it on websites. We under-promise. Well, that's an over-promise right there when you say we under-promise and over-deliver. And then you're saying the culture of your firm is to allow for scope creep.
Yeah.
That's what I hear when somebody says we under-promise, but we always over-deliver.
Right.
Oh, well, that's where the profit goes.
And it comes from some psychological stuff. It comes from where you learned. It comes from how much work you have and how much you can waste, your theory of constraints. It's such an interesting topic to me. But when somebody hears the phrase scope creep, they know exactly what we're talking about, they think. But they haven't really carefully articulated how they view scope creep, their own particular perspective on it. That's kind of what I'm interested in surfacing for people as they go through this.
Okay, so when you're faced with uncertain scope, you're saying that you can see 7 different options that people have when they're faced with uncertain scope.
Right.
What's option number 1?
Option number 1 is that you just instinctively need to shoot really high in the pricing to protect yourself. And this is one of my favorite arguments around scope creep. Because if you have a client that's very specifically pushing you to give them a price, but you don't feel like you have enough information at the moment, your argument to them is, listen, the only way I can emerge from this request that you've given me is to shoot really high because I can't risk not covering all the time and I don't have enough information yet to know what you need. So I'm going to have to shoot really high and that's uncomfortable for me and it's really not in your best interest. So maybe we should do something else. So that's the first argument. That's the first option is say, okay, well, you've given me somewhat of a scope, but it's not real clear. There's a lot of questions I still have about this. I'm going to have to protect myself and shoot really high. But that is one option that you have when you're trying to deal with the scope creep issue.
So it gives you a buffer to work with, but you're still working with loosely defined scope. So you're not fully protected, right? Unless you just go like an order of magnitude higher or multiples, like super high.
Yeah, maybe just historically, you just say, listen, similar clients that we come across like this, we've taken a bath, a 20% bath. We're just going to have to add that. But it's all just guesswork. And all that guesswork, to the degree that you're protecting yourself, is not in the client's best interest, because they are potentially paying way more than they need to just because you have to protect yourself.
Yeah. And we've talked about this before, but extra margin built into the job gives you a tool with which to improve client loyalty, because a problem arises, and whether it's of your doing or not, you have the wherewithal, the margin to go ahead and fix the problem.
Right.
So there's lots of reasons to price high. So you're saying you protect yourself from scope creep by shooting really high in the price. If the client is demanding a price from you, you say, okay, I got a price. It's really big. Here it is, X.
Right.
What's option number 2?
Option number 2 is sort of the opposite reaction. You have the exact same scenario, but instead of shooting really high to protect yourself, you shoot really low because you want to get the job. And you're just kicking the can down the road because you don't know the specifics, but you know you have underpriced this thing because you want to get the job. And you're already setting yourself up for many difficult conversations down the road where you have to come back and say, well, listen, like you're going to have to nitpick them on everything related to scope creep, and it's going to really piss them off. You could be doing it with the sort of right heart, but some firms are just deceitful about this. They just intentionally underbid something, and they pretty much know or assume that they're going to have to make some changes. But at that point, the client is already too far into the relationship. They can't just switch to another horse. So they kind of feel like their hands are tied and they resent it. It's a terrible way to get this work because it sets up a bad relationship with the client that's not likely to continue very well. So the first one, shoot high to protect yourself. The second one, shoot low to get the job, knowing you're going to screw them later. And that is the actual modus operandi of some firms. And I just think it's wrong.
I don't see it a lot in the creative firm space. And where I do see it, I see these people, and I tend to side with them much of the time. I see them rationalizing it as, well, this is the game that procurement forces us to play.
Right.
And from my point of view, when you're in these battles with procurement, the gloves are off and every tool is a viable tool. I wouldn't personally do it. It grates against my personality, but I've seen clients do it and I've fully endorsed it. If this is the game that you have to play, that they are making you play, then play the game, and it's basically the change order strategy of business.
See, I got you wound up again talking about procurement. Every time that topic comes up, your heart goes faster and your voice is raised.
You know, I'm doing another podcast. I've recorded all the interviews with procurement people, and that's dropping soon.
Yeah, but keep your anger over in that podcast, not in this one. It's like, okay, I know I signed the Geneva Convention, but I am going to torture this guy. The rules are out. This is procurement. Forget it. Anyway.
Ryanair, I think of, the business. Ryanair works that way.
Right.
Oh, you want oxygen?
You want to wear your shoes on board. Oh, that's another $5, right?
€5. Yeah. Okay, so dealing with uncertain scope creep, strategy number 1 is just shoot really high price-wise to protect yourself. Strategy number 2 is the inverse of that. It's just lowball everything and lean on change orders. Say, well, that's out of scope. I'll get you a change order, etc. And what's strategy number 3?
This strategy number 3 is done mostly by software engineering firms. They're building some digital product or digital property or something like that.
I sense a sprint coming.
Yeah, exactly. They dive. So the third option you have to deal with this scope issue is just to go talk the client into an agile sort of relationship with an unending stream of sprints. So it's $18,000 a month or every 2 weeks for 3 people or, whatever it is in your world. And this can actually be a wonderful way to not leave money on the table, but you're really capping how much money you can make. But the problem with this, if you think this is a solution, is talking a client into this, because they have to trust you completely and they have to be able to push back on the potential criticism from within the client side about this. Obviously, It's a viable option, but it's a very different way of thinking. It caps how much money you can make, and it requires deep trust in the relationship. You're not saying, okay, it's a $780,000 web project. This is everything that's included. It's going to take this long. And here's the scope. And as long as we don't extend the scope, then this is exactly what you're going to pay. In a more agile relationship, you're just saying we are going to use our best efforts and we're going to work on the most important things every sprint, and we're just going to get things done and we're going to check in. There might be a total cap on the value of it, but scope is not a carefully defined part of all of this. I don't like this approach, but a lot of software engineering firms are using it.
We did an episode called 5 Levels of Pricing Success, and this is level 2. It's basically maximum labor arbitrage. It's maximum utilization, right? So you're fully utilized. Mm-hmm. And if you're selling time, to be fully utilized is the dream.
Right.
And then you get to this, and it's like, oh, I'm realizing the dream. But there are firms over here making multiples of what you're making. So you've maxed out that model. There are other models. So I'm with you. I think there's a time and a place for selling sprints. I think some clients are more open to it. It tends to lend itself to software development. But part of me maintains that I think software developer firms tend towards sprints because the owners tend to be engineers who are more risk averse and they want to push all the risks to the client. I'm willing to eat those words one day, but I still think that's a main reason why there's a preference for sprints. But yeah, you can see the pluses and the minuses in this model. So that's a third way, a third strategy for kind of keeping scope under wraps. And it does a good job of achieving just that, right? Okay, no scope, that's fine. We've got a pricing model that works with that perfectly. And if the client's willing to go along, that's not so bad.
Yeah, exactly. And more clients are.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
What's number 4?
4 is, and this is the one I really like, it's to sell a paid diagnostic or a road mapping sort of a process that fits with developing your own way of working. It fits in with the whole model discussion that we talked about. But essentially selling a paid, not an unpaid, but a paid diagnostic to determine scope. And the idea is that, let's say it's a really great potential client relationship and they've told you what they have for this. They've set aside $800,000 for this and they want to use you, but they just want to check a box and say, what are we going to get for this $800,000? Well, your best option at that point is say, okay, let's peel off X amount. Maybe it's, I don't know, 60,000 or something. And let's dive in really deep and map this whole thing out. Let's figure out exactly what you're going to get for this. And if we spend the first X amount on this diagnostic, we can spend the rest of the money so much smarter. And this is much better than the next alternative we're going to talk about because you're not giving away your time. And actually, I think of this sort of paid diagnostic as something you ought to be doing even if you're not going to do the work itself. So pretend that there's a very capable client that comes to you that has an in-house department. They're going to be doing the work that you're recommending, but they need an outside objective voice on this. Actually, this should probably be your most profitable project ever, this diagnostic or road mapping. You do this, you hand it to them, and then they implement it. But whether you implement it or they implement it doesn't matter. This is probably the best way to not lose your shirt, to get paid for your thinking, and so on. So paid diagnostic to determine scope. That's the 4th one.
If you have to do a whole bunch of work to write a proposal, a whole bunch of research, diving into the client's situation, to scope, price, and write a proposal, then you should get paid to do that work. And the way you get paid is you sell a diagnostic. The language, it might sound something like, okay, there's a lot of information we need to gather to be able to scope this properly. So let's take a small amount of your budget and let's engage for a couple of weeks. We have this thing, it's called an X road mapping playbook development, et cetera, whatever it is. It's diagnosing and prescribing, coming up with a plan that allows you to scope it. And then we'll present the findings and recommendations, included in the recommendations, different ways you can engage us to implement those recommendations.
Yep, exactly right.
What's number 5?
Number 5 is to do the same thing to figure out exactly what the client needs, but to put it into a 90-page proposal that you're not getting paid for.
Is this the spoof part of the episode?
Yeah. This is when people need to pause and go listen to, what was the name of that one?
Secrets behind the killer proposal, and then secrets behind the killer website.
Our very best work.
Yeah.
Our very best
We're done
work.
giving away secrets. Or are we?
So a long-ass unpaid proposal, this is the old way to do it. And there are very few firms doing this now, but you still see it. You still see it a lot with PR firms. You see it in industries where procurement is really there all the time. It's more common with government-related work where you don't want to get burned, and they're not going to pay for a diagnostic, and they're not going to do an agile approach. And you don't want to shoot high to cover yourself because they won't accept it. You don't want to shoot low because you're afraid you'll lose your shirt. So you decide to put a scope around losing your shirt. You turn 3 people loose for 10 days and they write this 90-page proposal unpaid, and then the client accepts it or they don't accept it. If they don't accept it, you don't get paid. Here's one little note though. If you are doing these long-ass unpaid proposals, then the price of all that work needs to be built into the price of the project. And if the client says, yes, we accept it, then bam, all that time you've already spent needs to get paid for. That would be one way to sort of minorly correct this bad instinct that you have.
I just throw up in my mouth a little bit when we talk about this.
Yeah.
It's great to hear you say that you don't see this much anymore. I hadn't stopped to think that, but once you said it, I thought, oh yeah, things really have changed. And I'm not sure what's changed. Maybe we've made an impact in the world, David, but maybe things have just changed. We don't encounter that a lot. I mean, it's still out there, and maybe it's the type of firm that isn't coming to us for training. People losing their shirts on 90-page proposals, it's not nearly as common as it used to be. And again, that might just be selection bias. I don't know. Maybe listeners let us know. Do you throw up in your mouth a little bit when we talk about 90-page unpaid proposals, or is that the norm for you?
Yeah. Or are you following every word we mentioned in that earlier episode and you just now figured out that we were kidding with everything we said in that? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we're talking about 7 options when you're faced with uncertain scope, and we're now on number 6, second last one.
Yeah. So if this is really an issue for you, where you're constantly struggling with scope because you don't want to lose money, then I would say one of the things you ought to consider is to look at your service offering design, because the tighter your positioning, then the more predictable your work is for clients and the less you need to rethink scope every time. So one of the solutions is a long-term, deeper sort of a solution if you keep facing this scope thing. And that's how you work for clients and why the work you're doing for client A is so unlike the work you're doing for client B. Obviously, the recommendations are going to be different in every case, but the way you approach it and the process you use, the framework, how much time you spend, you should start to see those patterns. And great positioning always needs to grow and move over into your service offering design too. So this is just one of those notes just to get people thinking that maybe the issue is not scope creep, maybe the issue is service offering design, and then you could fix that, tighten that up a little bit. It's not going to be a quick fix, obviously, but something over 3 or 4 months, you could start thinking a little bit differently about this. You could talk more about it on the website, set those expectations differently, and be more in charge rather than just sitting there waiting for a client to tell you what they need when that may not be in their best interest.
This is interesting to me. So you're saying don't miss the cues that the market is telling you, like a constant scope creep. If you're solving the same problem over and over again, something is fundamentally amiss.
Right.
What is fundamentally amiss? What is the market telling you about the way you package up your services or even what your services are?
Yeah. And what the market is telling you is that they value your expertise, but that they don't have a prescribed idea about how you're going to solve the particular problems. And I think this is an area where the other branches of the professional services are better at this than we are. We tend to go at it with a blank slate each time, and I'm not sure that's really in the client's best interest.
What's the root of that, do you think? I was wondering that off the top. Is this a bigger problem for us? I mean, dentists don't have this problem,
No.
right? It's pretty clear. I'm putting a crown on that molar. But lawyers, accountants, etc.
We don't want to reuse things. We feel like part of what makes a solution fantastic is that nobody has thought of it before, without realizing that we could probably reuse a lot of, not the actual creative, but a lot of the way we work. I just think there's more room for that if we're open to it.
Okay. And then the last strategy for dealing with uncertain scope creep is what?
So you bid this low because you wanted the work, but your solution to still making money on it is to go to the team and say, hey, team, normally I know that when we do an identity, it's $60,000, but we've only got $40,000 for this. So I need you to do fewer options. I need you to work more efficiently. Let's all be careful about how much time we put in this. I can't even say this with a straight face because it never works. I'm writing an article right now. I haven't figured out all the language, so I haven't published it yet. But the idea is that you can't find clients that are paying less than your normal way of working and expect to actually make money on that, because you have a particular approach, you have a certain thoroughness, certain number of people that need to be involved, and you just aren't very good at pulling that back and saying, okay, yeah, we can make money on 40 instead of 60. It just doesn't happen. People aren't happy, they're unsettled, they keep thinking they're not doing a good job. So it's in here because a lot of people do it, but it's not in here because it's a good idea.
We've largely ignored the subject of how scope creep is tied to pricing models. We touched on it a little bit, but I was in a training session this morning with one of our coaches. His day job is running his own agency, and he coaches for us a little bit on the side. And during one of the breaks, he made the comment that they switched to value-based pricing about 4 years ago. And one of the things he noticed is these conversations around scope creep are a whole lot easier. And that surprised me a little bit, not a lot, a little bit. But when we talked through it, it's like, if you're going to price based on value, you actually have to have these meaningful business conversations where value creation is the focus. You just end up in a depth of conversation and transparency with your client that you wouldn't otherwise. So when scope creep starts to happen, you push back on it, the client is usually in alignment. You're usually fairly closely aligned to what it is we're trying to accomplish and the value to be created. That it happens less often, and if you have to push back, the client's more understanding. So that's what he shared with me. It was something I wasn't expecting to hear.
I think we could say pretty safely that the firms that are populated with adults who are willing to have difficult conversations are the ones making more money. A lot of our tendencies around scope creep are designed to minimize conflict, minimize difficult conversations.
Yes.
So you need to practice having these in a way that's not at all defensive, that honestly talks about protecting yourself. That's a valid way to approach this, and also protecting the client and coming at this without a fear of losing that client relationship. If you have trouble having those conversations, you're not making a lot of money.
So you're saying this issue of scope creep tends to come down to communication and communication skills. Good communication equals no surprises.
Yeah, and not being too far over your skis. In other words, having your terms such that you're never doing lots of work that hasn't been paid for yet, because that's another issue that comes up where you'd really like to press the envelope here with the client, but they still owe you a lot of money, and so they have this sort of unmeasured leverage in the relationship. So you got to get that back. And also just a willingness to every once in a while burn a bridge, not in a way that's unnecessarily provocative or mean in any way, but you have to be willing to protect your firm. And sometimes it's not even going to make sense to take a stand, because by taking a stand, you're actually losing opportunity short term, but long term, it might make sense to do that. So anyway, scope creep is a really interesting concept that everybody understands. And I just wish we had I've never seen a real policy written out about it. I think it'd be good if people thought about it and have candid conversations and at least understand the role of scope creep at their firm, understand what their natural tendencies are in terms of dealing with it, and then maybe adapting to some better methodologies around it. It's all very interrelated. It's not just one thing, right? It's related to pricing, staffing, new business. Oh my God, it's like everything's tied up in it. So we could talk in lots of directions here.
That's a great summary. Is there one final lesson that ties this back to sex work?
Yeah. Yeah.
What have you got, Baker?
Don't write stray paragraphs in articles without flagging it as not publishable. We had a good laugh about it, but that would be the enduring lesson of all of this. Be careful what you write in an article, especially for something that might get published.
Yeah, lesson learned. Thanks for this, David.
Thanks, Blair.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Entz. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.